Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Before we begin tonight's reading, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to another new member of our Patreon family, Charlotte. Charlotte, thank you so much for your support of this podcast. It helps make it possible and it's much appreciated. If you are interested in the perks available to subscribers, you'll find a link to Patreon along with several other ways you can support this podcast in the show description. To learn more, you can also go to our website, www.boringbookspod.com. I hope you'll take the time to check it out. Now let's get to the reading. Tonight we're dipping back into classical Rome once again with a bit of biography. We're reading from the Lives of the 12 Caesars by C. Suetonius Tranquillus, to which are added his lives of the grammarians, rhetoricians, and poets, translated by Alexander Thompson and revised by T. Forrester, published by George Bell, London, 1896. Let's begin this evening with Volume 5, Claudius. Tiberius Claudius Drusus Caesar. Livia, having married Augustus when she was pregnant, was within 3 months afterwards delivered of Drusus, the father of Claudius Caesar, who had at first the praenomen of Decimus, but afterwards that of Nero. And it was suspected that he was begotten in adultery by his father-in-law. The following verse, however, was immediately in everyone's mouth. 9 months for common births the fates decree, but for the great reduce the term to 3. This Drusus, during the time of his being quaestor and praetor, commanded in the Rhaetian and German wars, and was the first of all the Roman generals who navigated the northern ocean. He made likewise some prodigious trenches beyond the Rhine, which to this day are called by his name. He overthrew the enemy in several battles and drove them far back into the depths of the desert. Nor did he desist from pursuing them until an apparition in the form of a barbarian woman of more than human size appeared to him and in the Latin tongue forbade him to proceed any farther. For these achievements he had the honor of an ovation and the triumphal ornaments. After his praetorship, he immediately entered on the office of consul, and returning again to Germany, died of disease in the summer encampment, which thence obtained the name of the Unlucky Camp. His corpse was carried to Rome by the principal persons of the several municipalities and colonies upon the road, being met and received by the recorders of each place, and buried in the Campus Martius. In honor of his memory, the army erected a monument, round which the soldiers annually, upon a certain day, used to march in solemn procession, and persons deputed from the several cities of Gaul performed religious rites. The Senate likewise, among various other honors, decreed for him a triumphal arch of marble with trophies in the Appian Way, and gave the cognomen of Germanicus to him and his posterity. In him the civil and military virtues were equally displayed, for besides his victories, he gained from the enemy the spolia opima, and frequently marked out the German chiefs in the midst of their army, and encountered them in single combat at the utmost hazard of his life. He likewise often declared that he would, some time or other, if possible, restore the ancient government. In this account, I suppose, some have ventured to affirm that Augustus was jealous of him and recalled him, and because he made no haste to comply with the order, took him off by poison. This I mention that I may not be guilty of any omission, more than because I think it either true or probable, since Augustus loved him so much when living, that he always in his wills made him joint heir with his sons, as he once declared in the Senate, and upon his decease extolled him in the speech to the people, to that degree that he prayed the gods to make his Caesars like him, and to grant himself as honorable an exit out of this world as they had given him. And not satisfied with inscribing upon his tomb an epitaph in verse composed by himself, he wrote likewise the history of his life in prose. He had by the younger Antonia several children, but left behind him only 3, namely Germanicus, Livilla, and Claudius. Claudius was born at Lyon in the consulship of Julius Antonius and Fabius Africanus upon the 1st of August, the very day upon which an altar was first dedicated there to Augustus. He was named Tiberius Claudius Drusus, but soon afterwards, upon the adoption of his elder brother into the Julian family, he assumed the cognomen of Germanicus. He was left an infant by his father, and during almost the whole of his minority, and for some time after he attained the age of manhood, was afflicted with a variety of obstinate disorders, insomuch that his mind and body being greatly impaired, he was, even after his arrival at years of maturity, never thought sufficiently qualified for any public or private employment. He was therefore, during a long time, and even after the expiration of his minority, under the direction of a pedagogue, who, he complains in a certain memoir, was a barbarous wretch, and formerly superintendent of the mule drivers, who was selected for his governor on purpose to correct him severely on every trifling occasion. On account of this crazy constitution of body and mind, at the spectacle of gladiators which he gave the people jointly with his brother in honor of his father's memory, he presided muffled up in a pallium, a new fashion. When he assumed the manly habit, he was carried in a litter at midnight to the Capitol, without the usual ceremony. Claudius applied himself, however, from an early age, with great assiduity to the study of the liberal sciences, and frequently published specimens of his skill in each of them. But never with all his endeavors could he attain to any public post in the government, or afford any hope of arriving at distinction thereafter. His mother Antonia frequently called him an abortion of a man that had been only begun but never finished by nature. And when she would upbraid anyone with dullness, she said he was a greater fool than her son Claudius. His grandmother Augusta always treated him with the utmost contempt, very rarely spoke to him, and when she did admonish him upon any occasion, it was in writing, very briefly and severely, or by messengers. His sister Livilla, upon hearing that he was about to be created emperor, openly and loudly expressed her indignation that the Roman people should experience a fate so severe and so much below their grandeur. To exhibit the opinion, both favorable and otherwise, entertained concerning him by Augustus, his great uncle, I have here subjoined some extracts from the letters of that emperor. Quote, I have had some conversation with Tiberius, according to your desire, my dear Livia, as to what must be done with your grandson Tiberius at the games of Mars. We are both agreed in this, that once for all we ought to determine what course to take with him, for if he be really sound, and so to speak quite right in his intellects, why should we hesitate to promote him by the same steps and degrees we did his brother? But if we find him below par, and deficient both in body and mind, we must beware of giving occasion for him and ourselves to be laughed at by the world, which is ready enough to make such things the subject of mirth and derision. For we never shall be easy if we are always to be debating upon every occasion of this kind, without settling in the first instance whether he be really capable of public offices or not. With regard to what you consult me about at the present moment, I am not against his superintending the feast of the priests in the games of Mars, if he will suffer himself to be governed by his kinsman, Silanus's son, that he may do nothing to make the people stare and laugh at him. But I do not approve of his witnessing the Circensian games from the Pulvinar. He will be there exposed to view in the very front of the theater. Nor do I like that he should go to the Alban Mount, or be at Rome during the Latin festivals. For if he be capable of attending his brother to the Mount, why is he not made prefect of the city? Thus, my dear Livia, you have my thoughts upon the matter. In my opinion, we ought to settle this affair once for all, that we may not be always in suspense between hope and fear. You may, if you think proper, give your kinsman Antonia this part of my letter to read. End quote. In another letter, he writes as follows, quote, I shall invite the youth Tiberius every day during your absence to supper, that he may not sup alone with his friends Sulpicius and Athenodorus. I wish the poor creature was more cautious and attentive in the choice of someone whose manners, air, and gait might be proper for his imitation. In things of consequence, he sadly fails. Where his mind does not run astray, he discovers a noble disposition. End quote. In a third letter he says, quote, "Let me die, my dear Livia, if I am not astonished that the declamation of your grandson Tiberius should please me. For how he who talks so ill should be able to declaim so clearly and properly, I cannot imagine." End quote. There is no doubt but Augustus after this came to a resolution upon the subject, and accordingly left him invested with no other honor than that of the augural priesthood, naming him amongst the heirs of the third degree, who were but distantly allied to his family, for a sixth part of his estate only, with a legacy of no more than 800,000 sesterces. Upon his requesting some office in the state, Tiberius granted him the honorary appendages of the consulship, and when he pressed for a legitimate appointment, the emperor wrote word back that he sent him 40 gold pieces for his expenses during the festivals of the Saturnalia and Sigillaria. Upon this, laying aside all hope of advancement, he resigned himself entirely to an indolent life, living in great privacy, one while in his gardens or a villa which he had near the city, another while in Campania, where he passed his time in the lowest society, by which means, besides his former character of a dull, heavy fellow, he acquired that of a drunkard and gamester. Notwithstanding this sort of life, much respect was shown him both in public and private. The equestrian order twice made choice of him to intercede on their behalf, once to obtain from the consuls the favor of bearing on their shoulders the corpse of Augustus to Rome, and a second time to congratulate him upon the death of Sejanus. When he entered the theater, they used to rise and put off their cloaks. The Senate likewise decreed that he should be added to the number of the Augustal College of Priests, who were chosen by lot. And soon afterwards, when his house was burnt down, that it should be rebuilt at the public charge, and that he should have the privilege of giving his vote amongst the men of consular rank. This decree, however, was repealed, Tiberius insisting to have him excused on account of his imbecility, and promising to make good his loss at his own expense. But at his death he named him in his will amongst his third heirs for a third part of his estate, leaving him besides a legacy of 2 millions of sesterces, and expressly recommending him to the armies, the Senate, and people of Rome amongst his other relations. At last Gaius, his brother's son, upon his advancement to the empire, endeavoring to gain the affections of the public by all the arts of popularity, Claudius also was admitted to public offices, and held the consulship jointly with his nephew for 2 months. As he was entering the forum for the first time with the fasces, an eagle which was flying that way alighted upon his right shoulder. A second consulship was also allotted him, to commence at the expiration of the 4th year. He sometimes presided at the public spectacles as the representative of Gaius, being always on those occasions complimented with the acclamations of the people, wishing him all happiness, sometimes under the title of the emperor's uncle, and sometimes under that of Germanicus's brother. Still, he was subjected to many slights. If at any time he came in late to supper, he was obliged to walk round the room some time before he could get a place at table. When he indulged himself with sleep after eating, which was a common practice with him, the company used to throw olive stones and dates at him, and the buffoons who attended would wake him as if it were only in jest, with a cane or a whip. Sometimes they would put slippers upon his hands as he lay snoring, that he might, upon awaking, rub his face with them. He was not only exposed to contempt, but sometimes likewise to considerable danger. First, in his consulship, for having been too remiss in providing and erecting the statues of Gaius's brothers, Nero and Drusus, he was very near being deprived of his office. And afterwards he was continually harassed with informations against him by one or other, sometimes even by his own domestics. When the conspiracy of Lepidus and Gaetulicus was discovered, being sent with some other deputies into Germany to congratulate the emperor upon the occasion, he was in danger of his life, Gaius being greatly enraged and loudly complaining that his uncle was sent to him, as if he was a boy who wanted a governor. Some even say that he was thrown into a river in his traveling dress. From this period, he voted in the Senate always the last of the members of consular rank, being called upon after the rest, on purpose to disgrace him. A charge for the forgery of a will was also allowed to be prosecuted, though he had only signed it as a witness. At last, being obliged to pay 8 millions of sesterces upon entering upon a new office of priesthood, he was reduced to such straits in his private affairs that in order to discharge his bond to the treasury, he was under the necessity of exposing to sale his whole estate by an order of the prefects. Having spent the greater part of his life under these and the like circumstances, he came at last to the empire in the 50th year of his age by a very surprising turn of fortune. Being, as well as the rest, prevented from approaching Gaius by the conspirators who dispersed the crowd under the pretext of his desiring to be private, he retired into an apartment called the Hermaeum, and soon afterwards, terrified by the report of Gaius being slain, he crept into an adjoining balcony, where he hid himself behind the hangings of the door. A common soldier who happened to pass that way, spying his feet and desirous to discover who he was, pulled him out. When immediately recognizing him, he threw himself in a great fright at his feet and saluted him by the title of Emperor. He then conducted him to his fellow soldiers, who were all in a great rage and irresolute what they should do. They put him into a litter, and as the slaves of the palace had all fled, took their turns in carrying him on their shoulders, and brought him into the camp sad and trembling, the people who met him lamenting his situation as if the poor innocent was being carried to execution. Being received within the ramparts, he continued all night with the sentries on guard, recovered somewhat from his fright, but in no great hopes of the succession, for the consuls, with the senate and civic troops, had possessed themselves of the forum and capital, with the determination to assert the public liberty. And he being sent for likewise by a tribune of the people to the Senate House to give his advice upon the present juncture of affairs, returned answer, quote, I am under constraint and cannot possibly come. End quote. The day afterwards, the Senate being dilatory in their proceedings and worn out by divisions amongst themselves, while the people who surrounded the Senate House shouted that they would have one master, naming Claudius, he suffered the soldiers assembled under arms to swear allegiance to him, promising them 15,000 sesterces a man, he being the first of the Caesars who purchased the submission of the soldiers with money. Having thus established himself in power, his first object was to abolish all remembrance of the 2 preceding days, in which a revolution in the state had been canvassed. Accordingly, he passed an act of perpetual oblivion and pardon for everything said or done during that time. And this he faithfully observed, with the exception only of putting to death a few tribunes and centurions concerned in the conspiracy against Gaius, both as an example and because he understood that they had also planned his own death. He now turned his thoughts towards paying respect to the memory of his relations. His most solemn and usual oath was, by Augustus. He prevailed upon the Senate to decree divine honors to his grandmother Livia, with a chariot in the Circensian procession drawn by elephants, as had been appointed for Augustus, and public offerings to the shades of his parents, besides which he instituted Circensian games for his father to be celebrated every year upon his birthday, and for his mother a chariot to be drawn through the circus with the title of Augusta, which had been refused by his grandmother. To the memory of his brother, to which upon all occasions he showed a great regard, he gave a Greek comedy to be exhibited in the public diversions at Naples, and awarded the crown for it according to the sentence of the judges in that solemnity. Nor did he omit to make honorable and grateful mention of Mark Antony, declaring by a proclamation that he the more earnestly insisted upon the observation of his father Drusus's birthday, because it was likewise that of his grandfather Antony. He completed the marble arch near Pompey's theater, which had formerly been decreed by the Senate in honor of Tiberius, but which had been neglected. And though he cancelled all the acts of Gaius, yet he forbade the day of his assassination, notwithstanding it was that of his own accession to the empire, to be reckoned amongst the festivals. But with regard to his own aggrandizement, he was sparing and modest, declining the title of emperor, and refusing all excessive honors. He celebrated the marriage of his daughter and the birthday of a grandson with great privacy at home. He recalled none of those who had been banished without a decree of the Senate, and requested of them permission for the prefect of the military tribunes and praetorian guards to attend him in the Senate House, and also that they would be pleased to bestow upon his procurators judicial authority in the provinces. He asked of the consuls likewise the privilege of holding fairs upon his private estate. He frequently assisted the magistrates in the trial of causes as one of their assessors, and when they gave public spectacles, he would rise up with the rest of the spectators and salute them both by words and gestures. When the tribunes of the people came to him while he was on the tribunal, he excused himself, because on account of the crowd he could not hear them unless they stood. In a short time, by this conduct, he wrought himself so much into the favor and affection of the public, that when, upon his going to Ostia, a report was spread in the city that he had been waylaid and slain, the people never ceased cursing the soldiers for traitors and the Senate as parricides, until one or two persons, and presently after several others, were brought by the magistrates upon the rostra, who assured them that he was alive and not far from the city on his way home. Conspiracies, however, were formed against him, not only by individuals separately, but by a faction, and at last his government was disturbed with a civil war. A low fellow was found with a poniard about him near his chamber at midnight. 2 men of the equestrian order were discovered waiting for him in the streets, armed with a tuck and a huntsman's dagger, one of them intending to attack him as he came out of the theater, and the other as he was sacrificing in the temple of Mars. Gallus Asinius and Statilius Corvinus, grandsons of the 2 orators Pollio and Messala, formed a conspiracy against him, in which they engaged many of his freedmen and slaves. Furius Camillus Scribonianus, his lieutenant in Dalmatia, broke into rebellion, but was reduced in the space of 5 days, the legions which had seduced from their oath of fidelity relinquishing their purpose upon an alarm occasioned by ill omens. For when orders were given them to march to meet their new emperor, the eagles could not be decorated, nor the standards pulled out of the ground, whether it was by accident or a divine interposition. Besides his former consulship, he held the office afterwards 4 times, the first 2 successively, but the following after an interval of 4 years each, the last for 6 months, the others for 2, and the third upon his being chosen in the room of a consul who died, which had never been done by any of the emperors before him. Whether he was consul or out of office, he constantly attended the courts for the administration of justice, even upon such days as were solemnly observed as days of rejoicing in his family or by his friends, and sometimes upon the public festivals of ancient institution. Nor did he always adhere strictly to the letter of the laws, but overruled the rigor or lenity of many of their enactments, according to his sentiments of justice and equity. For where persons lost their suits by insisting upon more than appeared to be their due before the judges of private causes, he granted them the indulgence of a second trial. And with regard to such as were convicted of any great delinquency, he even exceeded the punishment appointed by law, and condemned them to be exposed to wild beasts. But in hearing and determining causes, he exhibited a strange inconsistency of temper, being at one time circumspect and sagacious, at another inconsiderate and rash, and sometimes frivolous, and like one out of his mind. In correcting the roll of judges, he struck off the name of one who, concealing the privilege his children gave him to be excused from serving, had answered to his name as too eager for the office. Another who was summoned before him in a cause of his own, but alleged that the affair did not properly come under the emperor's cognizance, but that of the ordinary judges. He ordered to plead the cause himself immediately before him and show in a case of his own how equitable a judge he would prove in that of other persons. A woman refusing to acknowledge her own son, and there being no clear proof on either side, he obliged her to confess the truth by ordering her to marry the young man. He was much inclined to determine causes in favor of the parties who appeared against those who did not, without inquiring whether their absence was occasioned by their own fault or by real necessity. On proclamation of a man's being convicted of forgery, and that he ought to have his hand cut off, he insisted that an executioner should be immediately sent for with a Spanish sword and a block. A person being prosecuted for falsely assuming the freedom of Rome, and a frivolous dispute arising between the advocates in the cause, whether he ought to make his appearance in the Roman or Grecian dress, to show his impartiality, he commanded him to change his clothes several times according to the character he assumed in the accusation or defense. An anecdote is related of him, and believed to be true, that in a particular cause he delivered his sentence in writing thus, quote, "I am in favor of those who have spoken the truth." End quote. By this he so much forfeited the good opinion of the world that he was everywhere and openly despised. A person making an excuse for the non-appearance of a witness whom he had sent for from the provinces, declared it was impossible for him to appear, concealing the reason for some time. At last, after several interrogatories were put to him on the subject, he answered, "The man is dead," to which Claudius replied, "I think that is a sufficient excuse." I have likewise heard some old men say that the advocates used to abuse his patients so grossly that they would not only call him back as he was quitting the tribunal, but would seize him by the lap of his coat and sometimes catch him by the heels to make him stay. That such behavior, however strange, is not incredible, will appear from this anecdote. Some obscure Greek, who was a litigant, had an altercation with him in which he called out, "You are an old fool." It is certain that a Roman knight, who was prosecuted by an impotent device of his enemies on a false charge of abominable obscenity with women, observing that common strumpets were summoned against him and allowed to give evidence, upbraided Claudius in very harsh and severe terms with his folly and cruelty, and threw his stelae and some books which he had in his hands in his face with such violence as to wound him severely in the cheek. He likewise assumed the censorship, which had been discontinued since the time that Paulus and Plancus had jointly held it. But this also he administered very unequally, and with a strange variety of humor and conduct. In his review of the knights, he passed over, without any mark of disgrace, a profligate young man, only because his father spoke of him in the highest terms, for, said he, his father is his proper censor. Another, who was infamous for debauching youths and for adultery, he only admonished to indulge his youthful inclinations more sparingly, or at least more cautiously, adding, "Why must I know what mistress you keep?" When, at the request of his friends, he had taken off a mark of infamy which he had set upon one knight's name, he said, "Let the blot, however, remain." He not only struck out of the list of judges, but likewise deprived of the freedom of Rome an illustrious man of the highest provincial rank in Greece, only because he was ignorant of the Latin language. Nor in this review did he suffer anyone to give an account of his conduct by an advocate, but obliged each man to speak for himself in the best way he could. He disgraced many, and some that little expected it, and for a reason entirely new, namely for going out of Italy without his license, and one likewise for having in his province been the familiar companion of a king, observing that in former times Rabirius Posthumus had been prosecuted for treason, although he only went after Ptolemy to Alexandria for the purpose of securing payment of a debt. Having tried to brand with disgrace several others, he, to his own greater shame, found them generally innocent through the negligence of the persons employed to inquire into their characters. Those whom he charged with living in celibacy, with want of children or estate, proving themselves to be husbands, parents, and in affluent circumstances. One of the knights who was charged with stabbing himself laid his bosom bare to show that there was not the least mark of violence upon his body. The following incidents were remarkable in his censorship. He ordered a car, plated with silver and of very sumptuous workmanship, which was exposed for sale in the Sigillaria, to be purchased and broken in pieces before his eyes. He published 20 proclamations in one day, in one of which he advised the people, since the vintage was very plentiful, to have their casks well secured at the bung with pitch, and in another he told them that nothing would sooner cure the bite of a viper than the sap of the yew tree. He undertook only one expedition, and that was of short duration. The triumphal ornaments decreed him by the Senate he considered as beneath the imperial dignity, and was therefore resolved to have the honor of a real triumph. For this purpose he selected Britain, which had never been attempted by anyone since Julius Caesar, and was then chafing with rage because the Romans would not give up some deserters. Accordingly, he set sail from Ostia, but was twice very near being wrecked by the boisterous wind called Cirrus upon the coast of Liguria and near the islands called Stocades. Having marched by land from Marseilles to Gessariacum, he thence passed over to Britain, and part of the island submitting to him within a few days after his arrival, without battle or bloodshed, he returned to Rome in less than 6 months from the time of his departure, and triumphed in the most solemn manner, to witness which he not only gave leave to governors of provinces to come to Rome, but even to some of the exiles. Among the spoils taken from the enemy, he fixed upon the pediment of his house in the Palladium a naval crown, in token of his having passed, and, as it were, conquered the ocean, and had it suspended near the civic crown which was there before. Messalina, his wife, followed his chariot in a covered litter. Those who had attained the honor of triumphal ornaments in the same war rode behind. The rest followed on foot, wearing the robe with the broad stripes. Crassus Frugi was mounted upon a horse richly caparisoned, in a robe embroidered with palm leaves, because this was the second time of his obtaining that honor. He paid particular attention to the care of the city, and to have it well supplied with provisions. A dreadful fire happening in the Emiliana, which lasted some time, he passed 2 nights in the Diribitorium, and the soldiers and gladiators not being in sufficient numbers to extinguish it, he caused the magistrates to summon the people out of all the streets in the city to their assistance. Placing bags of money before him, he encouraged them to do their utmost, declaring that he would reward every one on the spot according to their exertions. During a scarcity of provisions, occasioned by bad crops for several successive years, he was stopped in the middle of the forum by the mob, who so abused him, at the same time pelting him with fragments of bread, that he had some difficulty in escaping into the palace by a back door. He therefore used all possible means to bring provisions to the city, even in the winter. He proposed to the merchants a sure profit, by indemnifying them against any loss that might befall them by storms at sea, and granted great privileges to those who built ships for that traffic. To a citizen of Rome, he gave an exemption from the penalty of the Papia Poppaean law. To one who had only the privilege of Latium, the freedom of the city, and to women the rights which by law belonged to those who had 4 children, which enactments are in force to this day. He completed some important public works, which, though not numerous, were very useful. The principal were an aqueduct, which had been begun by Caius, an emissary for the discharge of the waters of the Fucine Lake, and the harbor of Ostia, although he knew that Augustus had refused to comply with the repeated application of the Marsians for one of these, and that the other had been several times intended by Julius Caesar, but as often abandoned on account of the difficulty of its execution. He brought to the city the cool and plentiful springs of the Claudian water, one of which is called Ceruleus, and the other Curtius and Albudinus, as likewise the river of the New Anio in a stone canal, and distributed them into many magnificent reservoirs. The canal from the Fucine Lake was undertaken as much for the sake of profit as for the honor of the enterprise, for there were parties who offered to drain it at their own expense on condition of their having a grant of the land laid dry. With great difficulty, he completed a canal 3 miles in length, partly by cutting through and partly by tunneling a mountain, 30,000 men being constantly employed in the work for 11 years. He formed the harbor at Ostia by carrying out circular piers on the right and on the left, with the mole protecting in deep water the entrance of the port. To secure the foundation of this mole, he sunk the vessel in which the great obelisk had been brought from Egypt, and built upon the piles a very lofty tower in imitation of the Pharos at Alexandria, on which lights were burnt to direct mariners in the night. And that seems as good a place as any to end this evening's reading from the Lives of the 12 Caesars, Volume 5, Claudius, written by the great Roman biographer Suetonius. If you're interested in reading this classic work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook version from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, contact me on our website at www.boringbookspod.com or catch me on Twitter at boringbookspod. I really love hearing from you. I'm so glad you could join me this evening. Until our next boring book, good night.